The biting Wyoming wind screamed a prelude to doom, a symphony of ice and despair. One moment, Evelyn Hayes was part of a hopeful caravan pushing west. The next, a blinding white fury swallowed the world. Torn from her path alone, in an endless frozen hell, survival seemed a cruel mirage. But destiny had other plans. Lost to her own people, she would be found by another, a people of the plains, the Lakota. This is the story of a woman erased by a blizzard, only to be rewritten by the heart of a nation and honored with a name whispered in their sacred tongue. The year was 1875. Evelyn Hayes, a woman of 27 years, her dark hair, usually pinned with a semblance of city neatness, now often escaped in tendrils whipped by the prairie wind, adjusted the worn leather satchel at her side. Inside, nestled amongst a change of clothes and a dog-eared copy of Shakespeare, were her true treasures. Journals filled with pressed flowers, sketches of plants and notes on their properties. An apprentice botanist more by passion than formal training, she'd joined the westward migration not for gold or land speculation, but for the untamed bounty of new flora, a chance to study under the vast open skies of the Oregon Territory. Her mentor, Professor Armitage, had passed the previous spring, leaving his research unfinished, and his small Boston herbarium to Evelyn, along with the audacious suggestion she complete his work. The wagon train, a lumbering beast of canvas and creaking wood, had been snaking its way across the Wyoming Territory for weeks. They were late in the season, a gamble that Captain Davies, the trail boss, had assured them was manageable. "Just a bit more grit, folks," he'd bellowed each morning, his voice like gravel. "Oregon awaits." But the sky, for days now, had held a menacing stillness. The usual vibrant sunsets were muted, replaced by a sickly yellow-gray haze that clung to the horizon. The air, too, had changed. It was thinner, colder, carrying a metallic tang that made the hairs on Evelyn's arms stand on end. She'd noted the unusual behavior of the few hardy plants she could identify from the wagon, their leaves curled inward as if bracing themselves. The experienced outriders muttered amongst themselves, their gazes sweeping the northern plains with increasing frequency. They spoke of the White Death, a term that sent shivers down Evelyn's spine, despite the relative mildness of the preceding weeks. They were skirting the northern edge of the lands the Lakota called Pahasapa, the Black Hills. Sacred, mysterious, and largely unknown to the settlers, these hills rose like a dark rumor to the south. Captain Davies had specifically routed them to avoid direct passage through opting for what he believed was a safer, albeit more exposed, northern trail. The morning the world changed began like any other. The chill was deeper, yes, but the sky was deceptively clear in the pre-dawn light. Evelyn, helping Mrs. Henderson with her 2 young children, shared a cup of weak coffee by the sputtering fire. "Think we'll see snow soon?" Miss Hayes asked young Timothy Henderson, his breath pluming in the air. Evelyn smiled. "Perhaps a light dusting, Tim. Nothing this train can't handle." She tried to sound confident, but a knot of unease had settled in her stomach. By mid-morning, the wind began its insidious whisper. It started as a playful tug at bonnets and wagon flaps, but swiftly escalated into a keening moan. The sky, which had been a pale blue, began to curdle. Dark, bruised clouds, the color of old lead, rolled in from the northwest with an unnatural speed, swallowing the distant mountains, and then the horizon itself. Captain Davies rode up and down the line, his face grim. "Keep the wagons tight. Secure your canvas. We're in for a blow." The first flakes were innocuous, almost pretty. Evelyn watched them dance, melting on her gloved hand. Then, as if a signal had been given, the heavens unleashed their fury. Snow didn't fall. It attacked. It came sideways, driven by a wind that shrieked like a banshee, a solid wall of white that obliterated everything beyond a few feet. Panic rippled through the train. Horses whinnied, rearing in their harnesses, their eyes wide with terror. Cattle bawled, lowing pitifully as they were buffeted by the storm. The wagons, once symbols of hope and progress, became fragile shells against the elemental onslaught. Evelyn was in the Hendersons' wagon, trying to soothe the crying children, when their wagon lurched violently. A wheel had caught a snow-hidden rock or rut. Mr. Henderson was outside, struggling with the oxen, his shouts swallowed by the storm. "Stay inside, Miss Hayes," Mrs. Henderson cried, her face pale. But the canvas flap at the back of the wagon, improperly secured in the haste, ripped open with a sound like tearing cloth. A blast of icy wind and snow surged in, momentarily blinding them. Evelyn, instinctively trying to resecure it, moved towards the opening. Just as she reached it, the wagon gave another violent heave, tilting precariously. She lost her footing on the slick, snow-dusted floorboards. Her satchel, containing her precious journals, slipped from her grasp and tumbled out into the white chaos. "My satchel," she cried, her voice a thin thread against the storm's roar. Without a second thought, driven by the instinct to protect her life's work, Evelyn scrambled towards the opening. She saw it, a dark shape against the swirling snow only a few feet away. She leaned out, reaching. Her fingers brushed the cold leather, and then the world tilted entirely. A tremendous gust, stronger than any before, hit the wagon. With a groan of tortured wood, it tipped over completely, throwing Evelyn clear. She landed hard in a snowdrift, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. Disoriented, gasping, she pushed herself up. The blizzard was a living entity, a raging white monster, consuming everything. She could just make out the overturned Henderson wagon, a dark, misshapen lump a few yards away, but the rest of the train, the sounds of the other people, the animals, all were gone, erased by the impenetrable curtain of snow. She had her satchel. She'd landed almost on top of it, its strap tangled around her arm. But as she looked around, a horrifying realization dawned. In those few chaotic seconds, the swirling snow had disoriented her completely. Which way was the wagon train? Which way had she come? There were no tracks, no landmarks, only the howling, blinding white. She tried to shout, but the wind snatched her voice away. She took a few steps in what she thought was the direction of the Henderson wagon, but the snow was already deep, and the wind pushed her, spun her. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her. She was alone, utterly terrifyingly alone, in the heart of a blizzard that showed no signs of abating. The unseen enemy had struck, and she was its captive. The next hours, or perhaps days, for time lost all meaning in the relentless, featureless blizzard, were a blur of misery and instinct. Evelyn knew her first priority was shelter, however meager. The wind was the killer, leaching warmth with savage efficiency. She stumbled, fell, rose, and stumbled again, pushing through snow that quickly rose to her knees, then her thighs. Her city coat, though wool, was no match for the Arctic blast. Her bonnet was long gone, and the snow clung to her hair, freezing it into stiff strands. She remembered tales of travelers surviving storms by digging snow caves or finding refuge on the leeward side of rock formations. But here there were no rocks, no trees, only the undulating white of the open plain. She clawed at a drift, attempting to hollow out a small space, but the snow was too powdery, collapsing around her. Her mind, numbed by a cold, clung to a single, desperate thought: survive. Professor Armitage had once told her, while examining a resilient alpine flower, "Life persists, Evelyn, in the most astonishing ways. It adapts. It endures." The words echoed in her, now a faint mantra against the storm's deafening roar. She hugged her satchel to her chest, not just for its precious contents, but for the sliver of familiarity it offered. Inside, she knew were her tools, a small knife flint and steel, though the chances of starting a fire in this maelstrom were nil, and a tiny sealed tin of Professor Armitage's traveler's balm, a potent concoction of herbs for aches and chills. Small comforts, perhaps, but they were hers. The blizzard raged without pause. Night and day became indistinguishable. Evelyn moved when she could, driven by the fear of freezing if she stayed still too long, and huddled when exhaustion overcame her, curling into a tight ball, trying to shield her face from the biting wind. Hunger gnawed a dull ache at first, then a cramping pain. Thirst was worse. She ate snow, knowing it depleted her body heat, but the dryness in her throat was unbearable. She thought of the Hendersons, of little Timothy. Had they managed to right their wagon? Were they safe? Guilt sharp and cold as the ice crystals on her eyelashes pricked at her. She had scrambled out for her journals, her work. Had that selfish act sealed her fate? At some point, the fury of the wind began to lessen. The snow didn't stop, but it fell more softly, vertically. The world was still white, but the oppressive, shrieking malevolence had subsided, replaced by an eerie, muffled silence. Evelyn slumped against a drift, barely registered the change. She was slipping into a dangerous lethargy, her eyelids heavy, a deceptive warmth spreading through her limbs. This is how it ends, she thought, a strange sense of detachment washing over her. Not in a bustling city, not in a quiet herbarium, but alone in a frozen wilderness. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the clasp of her satchel. She pulled out one of her journals, its cover stiff with frost. If she was to die, perhaps someone someday might find this, might know who she was. She tried to open it, but her hands wouldn't obey. Then through the falling snow, she saw it, or thought she did. A flicker, a light impossible. Her mind was playing tricks, conjuring phantoms in the white emptiness. She blinked, her eyelashes thick with ice. It was still there, a faint orange glow pulsing softly in the distance. It was incredibly far, a mere speck, but it was undeniably there. Hope, a forgotten ember, flared weakly within her. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, cut through the stupor. Light meant fire. Fire meant people. She didn't know who these people might be. Outlaws, hostile natives, the remnants of the wagon train. It didn't matter. Anything was better than this slow, freezing death. Gathering the last vestiges of her strength, Evelyn pushed herself to her feet. Her legs were stiff, her muscles screaming in protest. Each step was an agony. The snow was deep unpacked, making progress torturous. She fixed her eyes on the distant glow, a beacon in the desolate expanse. It seemed to recede as she advanced, a cruel optical illusion. She fell countless times, her face plunging into the cold, soft powder. Each time the effort to rise was monumental. She talked to herself, a hoarse whisper. "Keep going, Evelyn. Professor Armitage wouldn't give up. That mountain saxifrage doesn't give up." She imagined the tiny, resilient flowers she'd studied thriving in the harshest, rockiest terrains. The light grew fractionally larger, resolving itself into what looked like the glow from a smoke hole or perhaps multiple fires. With it, came another fainter sensation, the smell of wood smoke. It was the most beautiful scent she had ever encountered. She was closer now, perhaps a few hundred yards. She could discern darker shapes around the light, conical structures, teepees. Lakota, a wave of fresh fear different from the primal fear of the storm, washed over her. Stories from the wagon train, whispered around campfires, painted the Sioux nations as fierce warriors, hostile to the encroaching whites. Captain Davies had warned them repeatedly, but what choice did she have? To turn back was to embrace certain death. To go forward was to face the unknown, a chance, however slim. She stumbled onward, her vision blurring her legs, moving on sheer will. She was almost at the edge of what appeared to be a winter encampment, nestled in a slight depression, somewhat sheltered from the worst of the winds. Several large teepees stood, like pale ghosts, in the snowy twilight smoke curling from their peaks. A dog barked sharp and sudden, then another. Figures emerged from the nearest teepee, tall, cloaked in furs and blankets. They moved with a quiet grace, even in the deep snow. Evelyn collapsed. She had reached the light, but her strength was utterly spent. She fell to her knees, then pitched forward into the snow, her cheek pressing against the icy ground. The last thing she saw, before darkness claimed her, were moccasined feet approaching, and the shadow of a figure looming over her. The scent of wood smoke and something else, a faint, sweet smell like burning sage. Consciousness returned, not as a sudden flood of light, but as a slow, hesitant tide seeping into the desolate shores of her mind. For an immeasurable time, Evelyn drifted in a disorienting liminal realm, a space suspended between the piercing memory of icy torment and an encroaching, unfamiliar comfort. She was vaguely aware of sensations that felt like phantom limbs returning to life. There was a profound softness beneath her, a yielding cushion of thick furs that seemed to drink the very ache from her bones. This was contrasted violently by the phantom chill that still clung to her thoughts, the ghost of the shrieking wind and the biting crystals of snow. The air itself was a paradox. It carried the persistent, comforting scent of burning cottonwood and the sharp, clean aroma of what she would later recognize as sage, a fragrance that seemed to scrub the blizzard's memory from her lungs. Muffled sounds ebbed and flowed around her, a soft scraping noise, the gentle crackle of a fire, and the low, melodic murmur of a human voice speaking in a tongue that was as foreign as the surface of the moon. At times, she would surface from the depths, her eyelids fluttering open for a brief, hazy moment. In these flashes of awareness, she perceived a world of shadow and warmth. The flickering light of a fire danced on the sloping, hide-wrapped walls of a conical dwelling, illuminating the smooth, pale poles that reached upward to a smoke-stained apex. And then there was a face, a woman's face that would swim into her vision. It was a face mapped with the intricate lines of age and wisdom, with skin the color of worn leather, and eyes as dark and knowing as a deep forest pool. The woman would murmur those soft, unintelligible words, her expression not of alarm or hostility, but of a calm, steady attentiveness. This was Tessina Herobe, an elder, and the respected medicine woman of this small, isolated band of Sikangu Lakota. It was her dogs that had first raised the alarm, their sharp barks cutting through the eerie silence of the receding storm, alerting the camp to the impossible sight of a half-frozen figure stumbling from the white desolation. It was to her teepee, a place of healing and wisdom, that Evelyn had been carried. When Evelyn finally awoke with a startling clarity. It was as if a veil had been lifted. The world snapped into sharp focus. She was lying on a thick pile of buffalo robes, their coarse hair soft against her skin and covered by several more. A small, well-contained fire burned in a shallow pit at the center of the lodge, its smoke rising in a steady, hypnotic column to escape through the opening where the teepee poles met the sky. The air was smoky, yes, but it was a clean, living smoke, and blessedly, deeply warm. Her gaze traveled around the surprisingly spacious interior, taking in the meticulous order. Intricately painted parfleche cases were stacked neatly, their geometric designs hinting at the contents within. Willow backrests, offering comfort for sitting, leaned against the hide liner. Tools of bone stone and wood, all foreign to her, had their designated places. It was the home of a person who lived with purpose and precision. Tessina sat a short distance from the fire, grinding herbs with a smooth stone pestle in a worn wooden bowl. She wore a simple but elegant buckskin dress adorned with finely wrought quillwork, and her graying hair was parted neatly into 2 long braids. When she noticed Evelyn's wide, lucid eyes on her, a small, reassuring smile touched her lips. She set down her work and spoke in a low, melodic tone. Evelyn understood none of the words, but the gentle, welcoming intent was unmistakable. Tessina rose and retrieved a horn cup filled with a steaming, savory-smelling broth. Hesitantly, Evelyn pushed herself up into a sitting position, a wave of dizziness and a chorus of aching muscles protesting the movement. Tessina supported her with a steady hand, bringing the cup to her lips. The broth was rich, likely made from wild game, and as she drank it slowly, she felt a wave of elemental strength spread through her depleted body. She was alive. She had been rescued. But as she handed the empty cup back with a grateful nod, the terrifying questions returned. Rescued by whom and to what end? Her question was answered in a fashion when the hide flap of the tipi was pushed aside, casting a momentary shadow across the lodge. A man entered, ducking his head to clear the low opening. He was tall and powerfully built, carrying himself with an imposing stillness. His face was stern, handsome, in a severe way, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw. But it was his eyes that captured her, dark, intelligent, and missing absolutely nothing. He wore buckskin leggings and a shirt lined with fur for warmth, and a single perfect eagle feather was tied in his long, black braided hair. This was Matto the bear, one of the camp's lead hunters and a formidable warrior. He had been part of the group that had found her collapsed in the snow. His gaze fell upon her, and it was a palpable force. It was not overtly hostile, not yet, but it was laden with a profound and unnerving caution. He was assessing her as a hunter assesses a strange track, trying to determine its nature, its intent, whether it signaled danger. He spoke to Tessina, his voice a low rumble, the words crisp and questioning as his eyes remained fixed on Evelyn. Tessina replied in her calm, even tone, gesturing with her head towards Evelyn and then making a motion that seemed to indicate the storm. A clear and serious discussion was taking place about her, and Evelyn felt a surge of intense vulnerability, like a specimen pinned to a board for scrutiny. Matto's eyes kept returning to her, weighing her, judging her. The language barrier was a formidable isolating wall. Finding her voice, which felt rusty and weak, Evelyn spoke slowly in English. "Thank you," she said, looking first at Tessina, then at Matto. "You saved my life." Tessina tilted her head, her kind eyes listening to the music of the foreign words, perhaps gleaning the grateful tone, but nothing more. Matto's expression did not soften. He fired a short, sharp question directly at her. She could only shake her head helplessly, her throat tightening. "I don't understand." Over the next several days, a tense and cautious routine began to form. Evelyn's physical strength returned in slow increments, but the aftermath of the severe frostbite was a constant throbbing agony in her fingers and toes. Tessina tended to her with a skill that left Evelyn, the botanist's apprentice, in a state of quiet awe. She prepared poultices of willow bark, a plant Evelyn knew contained salicin, the basis for aspirin, and other herbs Evelyn didn't recognize, applying them with a touch that was both practiced and surprisingly gentle. Evelyn watched everything, committing it to memory, marveling at the deep, intuitive knowledge of the prairie's vast pharmacy that this woman possessed. This shared interest in the plant world became her only bridge across the chasm of culture and language. One afternoon, she pointed to the herbs Tessina was preparing, then to her own leather satchel, which had been placed carefully nearby, as if it too were a patient. Understanding dawned in Tessina's eyes, and she brought the satchel to Evelyn. With stiff, clumsy fingers, Evelyn opened it, an immense wave of relief washing over her as she saw her journals. Though some pages were warped and stained by melted snow, they were largely intact. She showed Tessina her detailed sketches of various plants. A flicker of understanding, of a shared passion that needed no words, passed between the two women. Evelyn pointed to her drawing of a purple coneflower, a plant she and Professor Armitage had studied. Tessina's face broke into a knowing smile. She pointed to the drawing, then made a gesture towards her own chest and lungs, followed by a chewing motion. She was confirming its use as a potent medicine for lung ailments and to strengthen one's inner vitality, much as Professor Armitage had theorized from his distant Boston study. In that moment, a single fragile plank had been laid across the divide. However, not everyone in the camp was prepared to walk across it. Matto, in particular, remained a figure of profound wariness. He would often stand at a distance, observing her with his unreadable, assessing gaze. The appearance of a white woman washed up by a devastating blizzard that had scattered their own hunting parties and decimated their pony herd was a powerful and unsettling omen. The children were brazenly curious, while their mothers would watch her with a mixture of suspicion and fear, whispering among themselves whenever she stepped briefly from Tessina's tipi. One evening, the tension in the camp coalesced inside Tessina's lodge. Several important-looking men gathered for a council, including the dignified older man named Kangiluta, or Red Crow, who seemed to be the band's chief, and a grim-faced Matto. They sat in a circle around the fire, passing a pipe in solemn ritual before they began to speak. Though Evelyn could not understand a single word, the gravity of their debate was suffocating. A stern-faced elder spoke at length, his tone heavy with what sounded like fear, his gestures painting a picture of hardship and bad fortune. Matto spoke forcefully, his voice sharp with conviction, and he glanced her way more than once, his meaning clear. Even without translation, she was somehow connected to their ill luck. Tessina also spoke, her voice never rising yet firm and resolute, and Kangiluta listened to all with a heavy, patient stillness. A cold dread crept up Evelyn's spine. They were deciding her fate. The crisis that would seal that fate arrived like a thief in the night. A virulent sickness, a lung fever that brought with it a racking cough and a burning heat, began to sweep through the camp. It struck the most vulnerable, the elderly, and the very young. Tessina worked tirelessly, her knowledge vast, but the illness was aggressive and swift. One of the most gravely ill was Mato's own son, a bright-eyed boy of about 5 named Seton Little Hawk. Evelyn confined mostly to the teepee watched in helpless horror as the boy's condition worsened. She saw Mato's stern facade crumble as he sat beside his son, his fear a raw, palpable thing. She watched Satan struggle for each rasping breath, his small body consumed by fever. The symptoms were horribly familiar. They mirrored the lung fevers that tore through Boston's poorer districts each winter. And she had something that might help. Rummaging through her satchel, her hands shaking, she retrieved a small sealed tin of Professor Armitage's traveler's balm, a potent concentrated salve of eucalyptus pine resin and camphor. It was not an internal cure, but it was exceptionally effective at clearing congested airways when rubbed on the chest or inhaled with steam. She also had a pouch of dried mullein leaves, a plant well known in Western herbalism for its soothing effect on the lungs. The problem was Mato. He was a father lion, guarding his only cub, and he was deeply fundamentally suspicious of her and her strange Wasiku medicine. When Evelyn approached him, holding out the small tin, trying through gestures to explain its purpose, by pointing to Seton and then to her own chest, Mato's face hardened into a mask of fury and fear. He spoke a single harsh word and knocked her hand away, the tin clattering on the hard-packed earth. It was a violent, absolute rejection. He saw her offer not as help, but as a potential poison, a threat from the alien world that was already encroaching on his own. It was Tassina who intervened. More open, and having witnessed Evelyn's genuine botanical knowledge and her clear empathy, she picked up the tin. She sniffed the contents cautiously. Evelyn, seizing the chance, rubbed a tiny amount on her own chest, miming a deep, clear breath. She then pantomimed crumbling leaves into a bowl of steaming water and inhaling. That night, Satan's breathing grew terrifyingly shallow, each inhalation a ragged, high-pitched struggle. Desperation, cold and absolute, began to wage war with Mato's suspicion. Tassina sat with him, speaking to him in a low, persuasive voice for a long time. Finally, with a look of profound reluctance and utter terror for his son, Mato gave a single, sharp nod. The teepee was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and Satan's labored gasps. With Tassina observing her every move, Evelyn asked for a bowl and hot water. Into the steaming water, she crumbled the dried mullein leaves and added a small dab of the potent traveler's balm, releasing a cloud of sharp medicinal vapor. Working together, Tassina and Evelyn carefully held the struggling boy, draping a thin hide over his head to capture the rising steam. Evelyn also showed Tassina how to rub a minuscule amount of the balm onto the boy's chest. Mato stood over them like a stone sentinel, his entire being coiled with tension. His eyes fixed on his son. The weight of his gaze, of the entire camp's unspoken fears, was immense. Evelyn knew with chilling certainty that if the boy's condition worsened, if anything went wrong, her own life would be forfeit. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change began. The tight, rasping quality of Little Hawk's breathing seemed to lessen. The desperate fight for air eased. A few moments later, a deep cough racked his body, but it sounded looser, less painful than before. And then, miraculously, he settled his breathing, still labored but deeper and more regular. He fell into the first restful sleep he had known in days. Mato did not speak. He simply sank to his knees beside the sleeping form of his son, his large calloused hand gently touching Seton's forehead, feeling the heat that had already begun to recede. He looked across the fire at Evelyn. For the first time, the hard wall of suspicion in his eyes did not just crack, it seemed to crumble, washed away by a flood of relief and replaced by a raw, complex and grudging gratitude. Tessina reached over and patted Evelyn's arm, her weathered face breaking into a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. It was not a final victory. The sickness still held the camp in its grip, but a profound seed had been planted in the hardest of soils. The strange white woman, the omen from the storm, had possessed knowledge that helped save a child. She was not just a burden or a threat, but perhaps a source of unexpected aid. Evelyn felt the immense, suffocating tension in the tipi finally break. She had faced down not just a blizzard of snow and ice, but the blizzard of fear and mistrust in a warrior's heart. And in doing so, in the smoky warmth of that Lakota teepee, she had unquestionably saved more than one life that night. Little Hawk's recovery followed by the gradual healing of others, to whom Evelyn administered her limited supplies of balm and mullein, marked a turning point. It didn't erase all suspicion. Some still watched her with wary eyes, but it earned her a measure of respect, particularly from Matto and Tessina. Matto, a man of few words, began to acknowledge her with a slight nod. He even, on one occasion, left a small piece of roasted rabbit outside Tessina's tipi, a silent offering that spoke volumes. Tessina, her initial kindness, now deepened by shared purpose, began to actively teach Evelyn. Their lessons were a silent ballet of gesture imitation and shared experience. Evelyn learned how to scrape hides, though her attempts were clumsy and often resulted in uneven thinning or accidental tears, much to the amusement of the other women, who sometimes gathered to watch. She learned which berries were safe to eat, which roots could be ground into flour, and how to identify the subtle signs of animal tracks in the snow. Her own botanical knowledge, though from a different world, found common ground here. She showed Tessina pictures in her journals, and Tessina would point to the prairie nodding when she recognized a plant, or shaking her head and leading Evelyn to its Lakota equivalent. Evelyn learned the Lakota names for some plants, her tongue struggling with the unfamiliar sounds, while Tessina would patiently repeat them. The Paha Sapa, the Black Hills, often featured in their discussions. Tessina would point towards the dark, brooding outline of the hills visible on clear days to the south, and speak with reverence. Evelyn gleaned that they were sacred, a place of spirits of visions and of vital resources for the Lakota. The name itself seemed to hold a power, a deep cultural resonance. One day, Matto approached her not with his usual stern demeanor, but with a different kind of intensity. He carried a bow and a single arrow. He gestured for her to follow him to a sheltered grove of cottonwoods, a short distance from the camp. There, with painstaking patience, he began to show her how to hold the bow, how to nock an arrow, how to draw and aim. Her first attempts were laughable. The arrow skittered weakly off the string, or flew wildly off course, but Matto didn't laugh. He simply corrected her stance, adjusted her grip, his touch surprisingly impersonal, yet instructive. It was his way, Evelyn realized, of acknowledging her contribution, of perhaps trying to equip her with skills for survival in this land that was so alien to her. It was during these weeks of slow integration that a new, unexpected threat emerged. Not from the elements, nor from within the Lakota camp, but from her own past. Two riders were spotted approaching the camp. They were white men's scouts, by their look heavily armed and wary. The Lakota camp went on alert. Warriors, including Matto, armed themselves and rode out to meet them, their expressions grim. Evelyn, her heart pounding, recognized one of the scouts, Jedediah Smith, one of Captain Davies' most experienced men. They were looking for her. The wagon train, or what was left of it after the blizzard had regrouped and sent back a search party clinging to a desperate hope. A tense negotiation took place on the snowy plains just beyond the camp perimeter. Kangi Lutamato and other leaders met with the scouts. Tessina kept Evelyn inside her teepee, but the air was thick with apprehension. Evelyn could only imagine the fear and suspicion on both sides. White men armed near their winter camp, asking for a woman the elements should have claimed. After what felt like an eternity, Matto returned to Tessina's teepee. His face was a mask. He spoke to Tessina, then looked at Evelyn. He pointed towards the scouts, then to Evelyn, and then made the gesture of walking east, the direction her people had gone. The choice was being offered to her. She could leave, return to her world. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over Evelyn. The thought of rejoining her own people, of safety, of familiar customs and language, was undeniably powerful. She missed the easy companionship, the shared assumptions of her culture. She missed her books, her research, the life she had planned. Yet as she looked around Tessina's warm, smoky teepee, at the kind face of the woman who had saved her and taught her, as she thought of Little Hawk's smile, of Matto's grudging respect, a profound reluctance settled in her heart. These people who had every reason to leave her to the storm or treat her as an enemy had shown her compassion, shared their meager resources, and offered her a place in their lives. She had learned more about resilience, community, and the deep connection between people and the land in these few weeks than in all her years in Boston. She thought of her journals, her botanical quest. The Pahasapa, those sacred black hills the Lakota revered, were also said to be a unique ecological zone, a place Professor Armitage had only dreamed of studying. Here with the Lakota, she might learn things about plants, about survival, about life, that no book in Boston could ever teach her. The scouts were impatient. Jedediah Smith's voice, carrying faintly to the teepee, tinged with suspicion about why she was being held. He likely imagined her a captive. Evelyn stepped out of the teepee, squinting in the bright sunlight, reflecting off the snow. The Lakota warriors and the two scouts stood in a tense standoff. All eyes turned to her. Jedediah's weathered face broke into a relieved grin. "Miss Hayes, thank the Lord, we feared the worst. Grab your things, we'll get you out of here." Evelyn looked at Jedediah, then at Matto, at Tessina, who had followed her out at Kangi Luta. She took a deep breath. "Mr. Smith," she said, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. "I am grateful you searched for me, truly, but I am not being held." Jedediah's smile faltered. "Not held? But these are Sue, Miss Hayes. It ain't safe for you here." "They saved my life," Evelyn stated simply. "They sheltered me, fed me, healed me. I owe them a debt I can never truly repay." "That's commendable, ma'am," the other scout chimed in, shifting uncomfortably. "But your place is with your own kind. The train is waiting. We must leave before more weather sets in, or before—" He trailed off, but his glance towards the armed Lakota warriors finished the sentence. Evelyn knew this was a pivotal moment. To return was to resume her old life, her old identity. To stay was to step fully into the unknown, to embrace a life she could barely imagine. But the thought of leaving Tessina, of abandoning the fragile bonds she had formed, felt like a betrayal. "I understand your concern," Evelyn said, choosing her words carefully, "and I am thankful for it. But I have decided I will stay, at least for now." A stunned silence followed. Jedediah looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. Mato's stoic expression flickered with surprise. Tessina's eyes, however, held a deep, knowing warmth. "Miss Hayes, you can't be serious," Jedediah exclaimed. "This is madness." Perhaps Evelyn conceded, with a small, sad smile. "But it is my choice. Please tell Captain Davies, tell him I am alive and that I am safe, and that I am grateful." The scouts argued, pleaded, but Evelyn stood firm. Her decision, once made, settled within her with a surprising sense of peace. Eventually, reluctantly seeing they could not sway her and keenly aware of the armed warriors surrounding them, Jedediah and the other scout prepared to leave. They cast backward glances at Evelyn, shaking their heads in disbelief and concern, before finally riding away, two small figures receding into the vast white landscape. When they were gone, a quiet fell over the Lakota. Kangiluta looked at Evelyn a long, appraising gaze. Then he spoke his voice, carrying the weight of authority and wisdom. Tessina translated not with words Evelyn could understand, but through gestures, expressions, and a few Lakota words Evelyn had begun to recognize. The essence of it was this: her choice to stay, to trust them over her own people, was a significant act. It showed courage and a heart that was not entirely Wasiku. A few days later, as the first hints of a thaw began to touch the land, Kangiluta called a council. Evelyn was summoned. She stood before the chief and the elders, Tessina by her side, unsure what to expect. Kangiluta spoke at length. Mato also spoke, his words, now lacking their earlier suspicion, replaced with a tone of respect. Tessina, too, added her voice. Then Kangiluta rose. He approached Evelyn. He said in a voice that filled the large tipi a series of Lakota words. Tessina, her eyes shining, tried her best to convey their meaning to Evelyn. "You came to us out of the white storm." Tessina began, using gestures for snow, for being lost, for being found. "The blizzard, it erases, but it also reveals. It showed us your strength, your spirit. You did not perish. You sought the light of our fires." She gestured to Evelyn's help with the sick children, especially little Hawk. "You brought healing when there was sickness. You chose to stay when your own people called for you. This shows a brave heart, a loyal heart." Kangiluta then spoke Evelyn's new name, his voice resonant, Wiyakpa Hinhé. Tessina repeated it slowly for Evelyn, breaking it down, Wiyakpa Hinhé. She then explained its meaning, using a combination of gestures and the few English words she knew other Lakota had picked up from traders or prior, less fraught encounters. Snow, no more like shining snow, snow that fell, like a soft blanket, but then shines. She struggled for the exact nuance. Then, looking at Evelyn's fair skin, which had been protected somewhat from the worst of the windburn by her ordeal mostly within the tipi and her resilience, Tessina tried again. "It means woman who fell from the snow gleam, or perhaps more poetically, she who appeared with the shining snow." The name was meant to honor her sudden appearance after the blizzard, her survival, and the light she seemed to bring with her aid. A murmur of approval went through the gathered Lakota. Mato nodded, a rare smile touching his lips. Evelyn felt tears well in her eyes. She had lost her path, her identity as Evelyn Hayes, apprentice botanist from Boston. But in its place, she had been given something new, something precious, forged in the crucible of survival and acceptance. Wiyakpa Hinhé, she who appeared with the shining snow. It was a name that tied her to this land, to these people, to the very storm that had nearly claimed her. She looked at Tessina, at Mato, at Kangiluta. She couldn't speak the words of gratitude in their tongue, but she hoped her expression conveyed the depth of her emotion. She bowed her head slightly, a gesture of respect and acceptance. She was no longer just a lost Wasiku woman. She had a place. She had a name. And in the heart of the vast, wild prairie, under the shadow of the sacred Pahasapa, a new chapter of her life was beginning. The thaw arrived not as a gentle request, but as a powerful, undeniable force, transforming the vast, silent world of white into a dynamic, burgeoning landscape. The air, once sharp and sterile, grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and melting snow. Rivers long choked with ice began to crack and groan, their liberated waters swelling into turbulent brown torrents that carved new paths through the plains. Everywhere, there was the sound of dripping and flowing, a constant liquid percussion that broke the winter's hold. The prairie grasses, pressed and yellowed, showed tentative shoots of vibrant green at their roots. With this great awakening, the Sikangu camp stirred with a renewed and palpable energy, the people preparing for their traditional move towards the summer hunting grounds that lay in the shadows of the sacred Pahasapa. For Evelyn, now known to the band as Wiyakpa Hinhé, this transition marked her first true season as one of them. Life settled into a new rhythm, one dictated not by the hands of a clock, but by the angle of the sun and the urgent needs of a migrating community. Yet her decision to remain, forged in a moment of profound conviction, was not without its lingering complexities. There were evenings when the loneliness was a physical ache, a hollow space in her chest that the warmth of the tipi fire could not fill. She would watch the families huddled together, listening to the familiar cadence of a language she was only just beginning to decipher, and feel the immense gulf of her own past. She missed the simple, thoughtless ease of a shared joke, the familiar weight of her hard-bound books, the sharp, acidic taste of Professor Armitage's favorite tea. The worried, uncomprehending faces of Jedediah Smith and the other scout would swim in her memory, making her question her sanity. Had she traded her entire world for a reckless, romantic, and ultimately foolish impulse? But these waves of doubt, sharp as they were increasingly outmatched by the sheer, undeniable richness of her new existence. The moments of connection were potent antidotes to her isolation. Her studies with Tessina evolved into a profound apprenticeship, a daily immersion in the deep well of Lakota ethnobotany. It was a knowledge far beyond simple identification. Tessina taught her that gathering plants was a sacred exchange. One did not simply take. One asked permission, offered tobacco in gratitude, and sang the ancient songs that honored the spirit of the plant. The root gives its strength to us, Tessina explained through a complex tapestry of gesture and nascent shared vocabulary. So we must give our respect to it. Evelyn's journals, once filled with precise Latin names and detached observations, began to change. Alongside her sketches of root systems and leaf patterns, she now attempted to transcribe the phonetic sounds of the Lakota names and make notes on the spiritual protocols for their use. It was a unique, unprecedented fusion of two vastly different worlds of knowledge, a bridge being built on the pages of her worn, water-stained books. Her grasp of the language grew incrementally fostered by the patient daily instruction from Tessina and the uninhibited playful corrections from the camp's children. A now healthy and irrepressible little hawk became her most dedicated tutor. He would follow her like a curious shadow, pointing at objects, a stone, a dog, the sky, and proudly proclaiming the Lakota word, laughing without malice when her Boston accent tangled the guttural sounds. These moments of shared laughter, of simple human connection, were anchors that secured her more firmly to this new life. Mato, the stoic warrior, who had once regarded her with such deep suspicion, transformed into a quiet protector and an unlikely yet effective teacher. He communicated not with extensive words, but with action and expectation. He brought her a pony, a sturdy, intelligent mare, and taught her to ride not with a saddle and bridle, but with balance and instinct, guiding the horse with the pressure of her knees and the shifting of her weight. He took her on the periphery of hunts, not to participate, but to learn. He would crouch, motioning for her to do the same, and point out the subtle signs she had never imagined existed: a bent blade of grass, the faint scuff of a hoof, the direction of the wind carrying their scent. He was teaching her a new way of seeing, a sixth sense for the land that was as vital as breathing. In his focused, respectful gaze, she saw her transformation mirrored. He no longer saw Evelyn Hayes, the fragile Wasiku survivor. He saw Wiyakpa Hinhé, a woman of resilience who was actively striving to become a contributing member of their world. As the band moved slowly south and west, the Pahasapa grew from a dark, brooding rumor on the horizon into a powerful, tangible presence. Evelyn felt a thrill of academic and spiritual anticipation each morning as their jagged peaks appeared clearer. Tessina spoke of them often, her voice filled with reverence, explaining that they were the heart of the world, a place for vision quests, and the home of powerful spirits. Evelyn knew that her ultimate quest, the one inherited from Professor Armitage, lay within the unique ecological haven of those hills. To study the flora there, guided by the deep, place-based knowledge of the Lakota, would be a work far beyond anything she could have accomplished with the wagon train. Still, the path was not without its thorns. The cultural divide remained vast, a chasm that could open unexpectedly over a misunderstood gesture or a breached taboo, and the shadow of her former world loomed large and ominous. One afternoon, riders from another Lakota band brought news of a new fort being constructed on the edge of the Powder River country and of more blue-coated soldiers mapping the land in blatant violation of treaties. The news sent a ripple of tension through the camp, and Evelyn felt the weight of her white skin, a visible symbol of the encroaching threat. She understood that her presence was a profound anomaly, a secret that, if discovered by the wrong people, could bring disaster upon the community that had so generously embraced her. Yet despite the loneliness and the danger, she had found a sense of belonging she had never known in the stratified society of Boston. There she had often felt like an observer, a cataloguer of life. Here she was a participant, her hands calloused from scraping hides and grinding roots, her well-being intrinsically linked to the well-being of the whole. Her botanical mission was no longer a detached academic pursuit. It was a vital living practice. When she shared her knowledge of using a willow bark infusion to ease a fever, she received in return the generational wisdom of which berries to harvest after the final frost to prevent sickness in winter. It was a symbiotic exchange, a weaving together of mind and spirit, of science and tradition. Evelyn Hayes, the apprentice botanist from Boston, had indeed been lost to the unforgiving fury of the blizzard. But Wiyakpa Hinhé had been found in the warmth of a teepee, her identity reforged not of paper and ink, but of community resilience and respect. Her original path to Oregon had been obliterated, but a new, more profound one had opened before her. It was a path that led not just to a destination on a map, but into the very heart of the West, into the embrace of a people who had given her a new name and a new beginning. Her journey was far from over. As she rode alongside Tessina, the magnificent sacred Pahasapa drawing ever closer, she knew that in many ways it was just beginning. Wiyakpa Hinhé's journey from the icy despair of a blizzard to the warmth of the Lakota Circle, is a testament to the human spirit's resilience, the surprising paths to belonging, and the profound connections that can bloom between cultures even in the harshest landscapes. Her story reminds us that sometimes being lost is the first step to being truly found, and that honor can be found in the most unexpected of places, spoken in a tongue that becomes the language of the heart. If Evelyn's transformation from a lone survivor to an honored member of the Lakota Nation touched you, please give this video a like and share it with others who appreciate tales of courage and cultural encounter from the Old West. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more gripping stories of history, survival, and the untamed human spirit. What part of Wiyakpa Hinhé's story resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below.